So last week we discussed experimental treatments, and we discussed the two Jewish terms of Chaye Shah and Chaye Olam, which we translated to short-term life and long-term life, and how there is a debate. There isn't a clear consensus on how to deal with that. There's a debate on the two sides of the argument of whether it's okay to take experimental treatments, the percentage of success that has to be guaranteed if there's an obligation versus just permission or a prohibition. Tonight we will discuss a little bit of a different topic, and that is end of life, which is an important topic, a very nuanced topic, and one that we'll see soon doesn't necessarily have such clear-cut rulings in all areas, but in other areas there are some clear-cut rulings. You know, they say this story of this student who turns to her professor and says, "Professor, for my final hour of life, I'd like to be in your class." And the professor says, "Why? I'm so flattered. Why is that?" She says, "Well, because an hour in your class seems like eternity." Living long life, and whenever I give a blessing to people, may God bless you with long life, they always say, and obviously what they're referencing is the idea that we want good life. So as we did last week, we will begin with a case study, and there's no video this week of the case study, so I'll do my best to give it over outside. It's in your textbooks, but it's a long read, so I'll just recap it, and if you haven't read it yet, you can do so. If you have read it already, then you're ahead of the game. The story is, the case study is an individual, and really it's the classic case of physician-assisted suicide, or even more extreme, euthanasia. The case of just a moment. All right. The case of a Dr. David Goodall. I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, but Dr. David Goodall was a 104-year-old scientist who left his home in Australia. He flew to Switzerland and opted to end his life there. Why in Switzerland? Switzerland is known for its suicide tourism, where they allow physician-assisted suicide, no questions asked. And it was an unfortunate case because Dr. Goodall was an individual, a scientist, a very productive scientist. He wrote many papers. He had a very productive life. And really, it reached a point where he had to fight to stay in university as a unpaid research assistant, because the university was worried for his safety. He had to change his location. He fought them. He won the case. And he was a fiercely independent individual. And at that point, a few months prior, he had a fall at home. And while he was still mobile and he was still healthy, he was nearing end of life. And being a fiercely independent man, he didn't want people around him all the time. He didn't want to have a stranger acting as his carer. He didn't want any of that additional stuff, and therefore he opted to end his life. And the reason why he had to leave Australia is because physician-assisted suicide is not legal in Australia. It's not legal in many countries, and in most countries, an individual has to have a chronic disease, or at least not at least, the other way around. They have to be terminally ill, or at least have a chronic disease, a medical condition, where in Switzerland there's none of that limitations. He opted for physician-assisted suicide and flew to Switzerland, and that's where he ended his life. And this is really a story of modern physician-assisted suicide, which really is going to be one of the cases that we will discuss today. This idea of, what do we believe? Do we believe individuals like David Goodall should be free to choose to end their lives? And if not, let's say this doctor, this 104-year-old doctor, had been suffering from a terminal illness, do we think that he should be free to choose to end his life? That is case study number one. Case study number 2 is a shorter case study, and we'll read it inside on page 52. It's a quote from a halachic query, which was posed to the contemporary sage, really, of the prior generation. We've discussed him in the past class, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. He passed away in 2015. He wrote a monumental work of responsa called Tzitz Eliezer, and he addresses many of the modern ethical questions from a Jewish perspective. He writes as follows, or a question was posed to him as follows, and this is on page 52. An 11-year-old boy has been suffering for the past 2 years from a cancerous growth in his brainstem. A significant accumulation of fluid was recently detected in his brain ventricles, and a ventricle, you'll correct me, doctor, if you know how to pronounce this word, a ventriculoperitoneal shunt was surgically inserted to drain the excess fluid. His physicians now seek to implant a different tube because the original tube has become blocked or infected. This procedure entails minimal risk, but it will prolong the boy's life and suffering. Is there an obligation to proceed with the surgery? So case study 2 is very different from case study 1. Case study 2 is, here we have a very unfortunate story, a very sad and tragic story. We have an 11-year-old boy, and the question was posed to this rabbi. There is a procedure that can prolong his life. It will not heal the underlying issue, and it will still continuously cause him lots of suffering, but it will prolong his life and perhaps ease a little bit of the suffering, but it definitely will not ease all of the suffering. The procedure is a simple procedure. It's a minimal risk, entails minimal risk, but the procedure is, like most procedures, it's a painful procedure. Is there an obligation to proceed with surgery? Now, the reason I say it's a different situation from the first case is because the first case is not someone who's suffering. It's not someone who has a terminal illness. Yes, he's elderly, but it's not a reason, or perhaps not a reason to end one's life. So it's not. And secondly, the difference between the first and second case is the first case is actively ending someone's life. The second case is clearly a different case. It's passively allowing an individual to pass. And so when it comes to medical suicide, there are 2 categories, and these are the 2 categories that we will discuss. The 2 categories, and some of you may be familiar with these 2 categories, is physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Physician-assisted suicide is that the doctor prescribes lethal drugs, but the patient administers the drugs him or herself. Euthanasia is where the doctor administers lethal medication to the patient. And so we're not going to be really getting into the differences between these 2, physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Everything that we will discuss today about Jewish law applies to both, to physician-assisted suicide and to euthanasia. And so really what we have over here is the idea of actively putting an end to life or passively allowing a patient to die. First case is actively putting an end to life, and the second case is passively allowing the patient to die from whatever issues they suffer with. And so really the question at hand is, do we value minimizing the pain and suffering, or do we value every moment of life? And perhaps it can be applied to both cases. If we say we value every moment of life, then there's no difference between case 1 and case 2. If we say we value ending suffering, then perhaps there is a difference in case one and case two. There may not be any suffering in the first case. And then there's always the question of emotional, mental, psychological suffering, which perhaps is different than physical suffering, but perhaps has some application. Now, when it comes to these two ideas, we look at US law. And US law, secular law, is as follows. There was a landmark case called Cruzman versus Director, the Director of Missouri Department of Health. It's a 1990, it's called the 1990 Cruzman decision. And in it, the Supreme Court issues as follows. That first off, patients can refuse medical treatment. Why? Because US law puts at priority the autonomy of the patient themselves. They can decide whether they want, they can refuse treatment. And therefore, physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill is allowed in some places. In other words, it's up to the states to decide, but it is generally permitted here in the state of California. It is permitted. Physician-assisted suicide is permitted for the terminally ill. In some countries, there are no restrictions on assisted suicide. In the United States, it definitely is. In most countries, there is, as I mentioned earlier, in Switzerland, there are no restrictions whatsoever. But back to the Cruzan decision, the Supreme Court ruled that first off, a patient has a constitutional right to refuse medical treatment. This is on page 53. Number two, artificial feeding is considered a medical treatment in this context, and the right to refuse treatment covers it as well. And so a patient can legally refuse artificial feeding. Number three, the right to refuse treatment applies to both withholding care as well as withdrawing it. So one is active, one is passive. And number four, the right to refuse treatment pertains to all patients, even those who are not terminally ill. And so really what happens here is the focus on the idea that in the United States and really in most countries, the focus is on autonomy of the patient. And the question is, what would Jewish law say about these things? Now, it's an important introduction. I've made this introduction in the prior class, and I'm going to make it now again. This is for informational purposes only. Every single case is different. And we'll discuss it at the end, various resources that there are available out there for halachic, for Jewish law, whether it's healthcare proxies or living will on a halachic, from a halachic perspective. It's important to know that every single case is different, and we will see soon why. There are certain blanket rules, but by and large, every case has to be dealt with individually by a competent rabbi and obviously doctor. So before we get to analyzing this case, we're going to get back to the fundamentals. The fundamentals is we're going to see that the Jewish tradition really has grappled with these tragic questions throughout history with great sensitivity, with great compassion, with great understanding. And really these ideas that we'll discuss today take that all into consideration and look to the Torah for having a unbiased, really, outlook from God on what avenue one should take when facing these unimaginable questions. So we'll begin really from the beginning. In Yiddish, we say, fang an von Anfang. We'll begin from the beginning, from the book of Genesis, the famous God created human in his image. What does that mean? Noah experiences the flood. It's 40 days, 40 nights. The flood subsides. The water takes further 150 days to start receding. After a full year, full solar year, 365 days, Noah leaves the ark. Yeah, it was a long time to be on a cruise, 365 days. He must have contracted norovirus multiple times. Be it as it may, he finally leaves the ark with his family, and he comes out. And one of the things God tells him shortly after he leaves this ark is recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 9. And it reads as follows: I will demand an accounting for your lifeblood from the hand of each human, from the hand of each person for that of their brother. I will demand an accounting for a fellow human's life. Whoever sheds human blood shall have their blood shed by humans, for God made the human in his image. What are these verses talking about? The sages tell us as follows. If we analyze the nuance in the verse, we'll notice that it is talking about three different scenarios. And each one of these scenarios is applicable to nowadays. What's the first scenario? I will demand an accounting for your lifeblood. This is a prohibition against suicide. The Torah is telling us a person is prohibited to commit suicide. And where do we see that? Because it says for your lifeblood, for one's own blood. We have a prohibition for suicide. The next two parts is referencing homicide, right? From the hand of each human, from the hand of each person for that of their brother. Two different scenarios, but both of homicide, right? Now, what are these two scenarios? From the hand of each human, from the hand of each person for that of their brother. What does that second statement add to the first one? From the hand of each human, we're not allowed to kill someone else. Then it goes ahead from the hand of each person for that of their brother, or the brother is killing his other brother. Is that worse from a legal perspective? Obviously, from an emotional and a psychological perspective, it's how dare he, it's his brother, kin. Perhaps psychologically, perhaps they'd say there's more of a chance, whatever the case may be. But from a legal perspective, why would there be this difference between the hand of each human versus the hand of each person of each their brother? So there's one commentator who explains that this verse is worded like this to allude specifically to euthanasia. Let's have a look at text 2, the way he breaks it down. Text 2 on page 59. There are two forms of murder. One is murder intended to be detrimental to the victim, as an act of revenge or in order to seize the victim's money or the like. A second form of murder is to benefit the other, when someone is overwhelmed with tremendous pain and prefers death to life. The Torah addresses both scenarios. Regarding murder with detrimental intent, the Torah warns from the hand of each human. By contrast, the second form of murder, committed with the consent of the suffering individual and for their benefit, may even be perpetrated by a virtuous friend who may believe the act is a mitzvah. The Torah therefore warns from the hand of each person for that of their brother. Rabbi Mecklenburg is explaining that the Torah prohibits whether it's malicious murder or brotherly murder. In other words, euthanasia. Right? Because in certain circumstances, it may be perceived as a kind act. And it may be something that the individual has given their consent for. Classic case of euthanasia, where the individual has given their consent for it. And it may even seem an act of brotherly love. And that's really what the word euthanasia means. It's a Greek word which means a good death. And yet, what does the Torah say? Yes, this is a death which is meant to put an end to unimaginable suffering. It's not born out of hatred. It's not born out of anger. It's born out of love, born out of concern, out of compassion. Yet, what does the Torah call it? Torah brands it as murder. And why is that? Why is it considered murder? Let's look at the third statement in the verse. God made the human in his image. Every single human being was created in the image of God. And that's a discussion for another time, what exactly that means. But we can discuss that outside of the class. it'll take us in a different direction than we want to discuss. But for the sake of today's class, let's just take it as it is. Every single human being embodies a divine image, and therefore no person has the right to undermine or tamper with his sacred identity, this sacred entity. And the Midrash relates a story. The Midrash tells a parable of a king who was coming to town. And in anticipation of the king coming to town, the town minted coins of the image of the king. The town put up statues of the image of the king, put up murals of the image of the king. Now imagine there's an individual who goes ahead and defaces one of the statues or destroys one of the statues. At this point, this individual who did that, is it an offense against the metal? Is it an offense against the mural? Is it an offense against the coin or the statue? Not at all. It's an offense against the king who's coming to town. That's who it is. Every single human being was created in the image of God. The body, as we discussed earlier in last class, the body from Jewish perspective, from Jewish legal perspective, the body is not ours. It is on loan to us from God. And as such, taking the life of another individual, however compassionate it may seem, actively taking the life of another individual is prohibited by Jewish law in any circumstance. Actively taking the life of an individual. And this is why in the two tablets, there were 5 commandments in each tablet. 5 on the right, 5 on the left. The 5 on the right were divine, between man and God, divine commandments. I am God, your God, shall be no others, right? Do not use my name in vain, etc. What's the 5 on the left? Personal, between man and man. Civil laws, perhaps. Thou shalt not kill, murder, however you want to translate it, lo tirtzah, right? And all those. What is the top one of each one of the tablets? The top of the tablet on the right is, I am God, your God. The top of the one on the left is, thou shalt not murder. It's not by chance that it's set up that way, but rather you can read it that way as well. I am God, your God, and therefore thou shalt not murder. Why is that? Because it's telling us that it's an acknowledgement of God's existence. Murder is wrong because it erodes God's image. And therefore, the sanctity of a human being is the same for both a supremely healthy individual and a deathly ill patient on life support. And we'll get to that. There's a difference between active and passive and ventilator and all those questions we're going to get to, but this is the primary foundational ruling from which we derive many of the laws. It's really the perspective that sets the tone for tonight's class. And therefore, Jewish law forbids any action that expedites death, even if the patient is suffering. Let's have a look on page 60, text 3. In the Code of Jewish Law, a person in the throes of death, the term actually used is goses. Goses is a moribund patient, is regarded as a living person in every respect. Though the patient is in terrible agony and they consider death preferable, we are nevertheless forbidden to do anything to hasten their death. The universe and all therein belongs to God, and this is his will. And so, we go back to case study A. The halachic response to case study A is a clear no. Despite the benevolent and compassionate intentions, this doctor's suicide would be categorized as an act of murder from the Jewish perspective. And this actually would apply even had this doctor been suffering from a terminal illness at the time. And this is something which isn't debated by the sages. It isn't debated by the modern sages, by the contemporary sages, by the ancient sages, by the Talmudic sages. This isn't a matter of contention. It isn't a matter of disagreement. This is all sages, something that all, to my knowledge, all sages agree upon, that an act of physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, is prohibited in this case, in a case like case study A. And so far as we've presented Jewish law, secular law, and Jewish law differs from secular law as follows. Number one, physician-assisted suicide is prohibited, full stop. Number two, anything that will cause expedited death is prohibited. Now, again, this is an important caveat. We're talking about actively expediting, not passively. So not withholding, we're talking about removal, withdrawing, excuse me. We're talking about withdrawing here. We're not talking about withholding. And that's an important difference because we're going to get to withholding soon. Right now, we're just talking about withdrawing. Anything that will cause expedited death is prohibited. Now, we may ask, that, all right, there's a difference. The difference between Jewish law and secular law. Jewish law, secular law allows physician-assisted suicide. Jewish law definitely prohibits it. Secondly, Jewish law is against any act of withdrawal that will cause expedited death. So seemingly an individual who is on a ventilator. So if removing or switching off the ventilator, or to use the euphemism that's used by the public, pulling the plug, that will directly lead to the patient's death, would seem to be highly problematic from a Jewish perspective. Secular law has a clearly different view. Secular, especially U.S. law, says that a patient has a constitutional right to refuse all treatments without distinction between withholding or withdrawing. Just as making a hole in a lifeboat that is keeping someone afloat is murder, likewise, switching off a ventilator can be ethically problematic from a Jewish perspective, but we will see that there might not be an obligation to attach an individual to a ventilator in the first place. We'll talk about feeding tubes, and we'll talk about in some cases, even when one is on a ventilator, according to some opinions. So it isn't a black and white, but it's the perspective that case study A is a definite no from the Jewish perspective, which leads us to a question and perhaps another important part of the foundation and outlook of the Jewish perspective. And that is, if actively terminating a life is not only if actively terminating a life is an unconscionable violation of something sacred, what are its benefits? On the various levels of the individual, of the patient who is suffering, a patient who is terminally ill, a patient who's a comatose patient. What are the benefits of such a life from the Jewish perspective? And we're going to list 4 of those benefits as they are presented throughout Jewish literature. And there are more angles to look at it from, but we will look at it from these 4 angles. And that is, generally speaking, terminating a life actually undermines productivity at any stage. And that might be pretty surprising, but let's see how the Torah presents it. How is someone in these stages capable of accomplishing and capable of their life capable of meaning? Let's look at number 1, good deeds. Have a look in page 61 in text 4. There's a quote from the Mishnah, famous Mishnah of Ethics of Our Fathers. A single moment of repentance and good deeds in this world is greater than all the pleasures of the next world. And a single moment of bliss in the world to come is greater than all the pleasures of the present world. You see, the question is, how do we look at life in general? What is the purpose? What is the meaning of life? From a Jewish perspective, the meaning of life is God put us here with a mission, with a purpose that each one of us has a unique mission, a unique purpose. And so long as an individual is alive, that individual has meaning and purpose, because if not, God would not keep them alive. The fact that God keeps them alive means that they have meaning and purpose. Generally speaking, the individual's purpose in life is to perform mitzvahs, to perform good deeds. So much so, as we just read from the Ethics of Our Fathers, that a single moment of good deeds in this world is greater than all the pleasures of the next world. And how great are the pleasures of the next world that a moment of pleasures, of bliss in the next world is greater than all the pleasures in the present world. So we can imagine the greatness of a single moment of repentance and good deeds in this world. Now think about a patient who's terminally ill, a patient who's really suffering, a patient who's but is somewhat aware of what's going on. That patient has the ability to answer Amen. That patient has an ability to give charity. That patient has an ability to encourage an individual, a grandchild, a family member, a friend, someone entirely unrelated to the worker in the hospital. That patient may be able to utter a prayer, to observe a holiday-related mitzvah, like hearing the shofar, which perhaps pertains even to a comatose patient. They can hear a shofar, thereby fulfilling a good deed, which is really the purpose of one's entire existence in this world. And so this moment of a good deed, this single good deed, is more valuable than being the recipient of an infinite amount of bliss and pleasure, whether it's materialistic pleasures or even the divine delight of the next world. This moment, the single mitzvah, carries more weight. The single mitzvah is more cherished and more valuable than all the pleasures in the world. And so this Jew and his mission have not come to an end yet. Every moment of life that God gives is valuable. And this moment, this extra mitzvah of listening to the shofar, may be the mitzvah, in the words of Maimonides, as he famously writes, that maybe this performance of this mitzvah, of listening to the shofar, of giving this one more time charity, maybe this mitzvah may be the mitzvah that tips the scales of the world and brings about the coming of Mashiach, the redemption for all of you. Number two, what can a person accomplish in such a state? Repentance. We mentioned it in that Mishnah, the Ethics of Our Fathers. The sages tell us that if a man marries a woman on condition, and he stipulates a condition which isn't true, that marriage isn't valid. And he has to remarry her under the chuppah without stipulating that condition, because that first marriage was void. It never occurred. Yet the sages tell us that if an individual marries his wife and he says, I'm marrying you on condition that I am a complete righteous individual, even if this individual is known to be a terrible person, that marriage is valid. How can that be? How is it valid? We know he's not a good, righteous person. And the sages tell us because repentance can happen in a split second. It can happen in one's mind. An individual can repent in a split second, transforming them from a terrible person to an immediately righteous person. Repentance can happen in one's mind. And as such, if repentance is so valuable, as we just read in the Mishnah from the Ethics of Our Fathers, God sees it as something which is so valuable, which is really our purpose in this world. Who are we to take that away from anyone? No matter the condition they may be in, they still have an opportunity to repent, to return to God. Number three, the third value of these final moments is the light of the soul. Let's have a look in text 5 on page 62. The soul is an interesting creation. At the time of birth, when a new soul, an actual part of God, descends, a fresh expression of godliness enters the world. At the actual moment of birth, the soul's light and revelation remain concealed within a corporeal body. Its expression depends on the person actively sublimating their body through divine service. The more spiritual refinement a person introduces to their body, the brighter their soul shines forth, and the more it illuminates the world with godliness. This insight explains the verse, the day of death is better than the day of birth. So King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. The spiritual powers we receive at birth exist only in a state of potential, and it is impossible to predict the extent of their eventual actualization. When do they radiate in their greatest brightness? At the end of life. If every birth infuses the world with this great burst of divine energy, the body covers over on that great burst. And it is up to individual throughout their life to bring forth that light of their soul to shine in the world around them. As an individual progresses through life, the more mitzvahs they do, the more good deeds they do, the more Torah they study, the more they interact with positive relationships, etc., the more they bring that light of the soul to the forefront, and it affects those around. As a person ages, that light of the soul becomes stronger and brighter, more powerful, affecting the world around them. And so, yes, at birth, the light is concealed, but it progresses throughout life. And once an individual reaches old age, that soul light, that divine energy from their soul is affecting the world around it. It's shining bright. It's making a difference. Whether we perceive it or not, it's happening. And as such, this individual, in the final moments of life, their soul is shining brightly. Every moment, that soul is shining more powerfully and more bright. And then there is an entirely different perspective, but a fourth and important aspect. And that is the power every single individual, no matter their stages, no matter what stage they are in, has the power to inspire others. Let's have a look in text 6. This is from Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, who is a great rabbi, a great teacher. He's still a teacher in Jerusalem till today. And he writes as follows. Text 6, page 64. The reader may legitimately ask, what use is the life of a person who is comatose and incapable of any cognitive brain functioning? What use is an anencephalic child? I did look up that word to see how to pronounce it before the class, and I forget. Anencephalic. What use is an anencephalic child? Keep in mind, however, that a Jew believes in a soul and that the body is simply a receptacle for the person's true spiritual essence. Souls come to earth for many, many purposes, and we don't know why God sends souls into this life. Sometimes it could be that the spiritual destiny of a soul is to elicit certain things about the meaning of life and love and how we relate to the dignity of a human being. And when we fail to respond with sensitivity and respect for the unconditional value of that person's life, we kill off a small part of ourselves as well. These 4 ideas regarding how one may have a mission at the end of their life despite the lack of quality of life is really only phase 2. Ultimately, to borrow a term from Deuteronomy, the concealed matters are to God alone. When one has an appointed healthcare agent a healthcare proxy document. The individual, the agent, does not understand necessarily why their patient, their principal, made a particular decision. All they know that this is what the individual wanted. So too, with regard to our understanding of God's plans, there is little surprise that a specific fact or occurrence really is beyond our intuitive grasp. And ultimately is the idea that the different approaches of Jewish ethics and secular ethics don't start with end-of-life care. Really, they grow out of different approaches to life as a whole, what the purpose of life is. And so an individual who lives their life on their own terms may want to perhaps die on their own terms. And so if life is a contract that we only enter into because of the benefits offered, once the benefits cease to please, then the contract is meaningless. Life is meaningless. But if one lives on transcendenent terms, with a mission-oriented mindset, with a divine-oriented mindset, he or she can embrace their mission in life despite the hardships and apparent futility. And so when we look at the tragic case of someone pleading to be euthanized because of their terrible suffering, there's three ways to approach it. We can approach it emotionally, we can approach it intellectually, or we can approach it transcendentally. An emotional response might be, let's legalize physician-assisted suicide. Just legalize it. And really, perhaps that's what's been going on. An intellectual approach might be, let's not legalize physician-assisted suicide, which is the case of many organizations arguing against it, not because of the value of every moment of life, but because let's look at the bigger picture, and in the bigger picture, it could cause others harm, and it could cause harm on others who aren't necessarily willing to go, and yet it could be forced upon them. But looking at it from a transcendental approach, or a responsibility-based approach, our mission in life approach, then we're against physician-assisted suicide because, first of all, it recognizes, the transcendental approach recognizes that God alone has the right to tamper with the sanctity of the divine image. And secondly, the mission, meaning, and purpose are in every single moment of life. And let's have a look at a video of a colleague of mine who was stricken with ALS a decade ago. He was a rabbi here. He is a rabbi here in California, and he still lives in Hancock Park. And I derive much inspiration from him, and I'm sure you will as well. His name is Rabbi Yitzi Horowitz, and let's just let's get right into it.
I was talented. I could teach, lecture, sing, dance, and play guitar. I was strong and handy. Within 2 years, I watched all that slip away. I felt irrelevant. I was in jail. What possible purpose could I have, if I couldn't communicate? It hurts not to be able to kiss and hug my children, not to be able to talk and play with them. I could have been prey to a why me attitude and fallen into depression. The problem with why me, is that your focus is on me, the ultimate false deity. Instead, knowing that this is from Hashem makes me think, how could I serve his purpose from my situation? What can be done from my position now that could not be accomplished when I was well? Do I pray? Do I cry out to Hashem that he heal me? Yes, all the time. However, the illness has not broken my spirit. I continue using my difficulties as a platform to lift others up. What keeps me going is the realization that God is real, that He has a plan for the world and I am part of it. Everyone is a part of it and everyone's part is important. So if He put me in this position, He must want something of me that I can only do in this position. When you see it this way, instead of feeling down when you are in a challenging situation, you are filled with a sense of purpose. I choose to focus on the positive parts of my life, and that keeps me going. There is my wife, my children, family, friends, and you. Even within the suffering and difficulties, I can still contribute and help others. Through my blog, I have the opportunity to learn and teach Torah. I forge new friendships with the teens and yeshiva boys that visit. Find your mission and strength specifically from your situation. You don't have to be challenged with suffering to learn this lesson. You need only be alive, because it is Hashem that chooses for you to be alive. Recognizing this is the beginning of meaning in your life. If you are suffering, know that there is purpose in your struggle that can only be realized through your struggle. Find a way to turn your pain into positive, your struggle into strength. There is something else being asked of you, a new stage of your purpose and mission. True, I can't do many of the things I once could, but with what I do have, I have found ways to make a difference. The things I love to do most, to teach and lift others up, I'm still doing. Before, I would speak. Now, I write. It seems that because of my predicament, the words are more effective. In every challenge, or even tragedy, there is an opportunity. You don't have to fight it. Find a way for your struggle to take you to the next level. By taking this attitude, I was filled with a mission to uplift as many as I can through my articles. And my wife Dina became one of the most inspirational speakers and has uplifted tens of thousands. It doesn't fix the problem, but it makes our lives more meaningful and therefore more bearable. Being crushed brought stronger connections, new abilities, higher purpose, and deeper meaning. I've been blessed with a voice that can't sing, with a body that doesn't work. So I dance to a new rhythm. I'm Yitzi Hurwitz, and I know that I matter.
Yeah. So that's Rabbi Yitzi Horowitz. He lives here in Hancock Park. He is the Chabad rabbi of Temecula. There's another rabbi in Chabad of Temecula who now took on his responsibilities now that he can be there. But Rabbi Yitzi Horowitz, he's an inspiration to tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands by now around the world. He has a blog, and I encourage you to read his blog. He writes something every single week, and this has been going on for some 10 years now. And let me know if you'd like to visit him. He loves visitors. Talking about finding meaning and purpose in life, even in such situations. So until now, we discussed the spiritual dimension of it, the underlying outlook, and on the practical side of it, we discussed the physician-assisted suicide, the active withdrawal, removal of a patient from the ventilator, which are active steps with, especially when it comes to physician-assisted suicide, it's a clear no from the Jewish perspective. But now the question is, and perhaps the more practical question, the question that arises more often, is a question about passively withholding the medical care. What does Jewish law have to say about that? Knowing the value of every moment of life, knowing the importance of every breath, do we say extend life at all costs? Or, which would seem that even passively withholding medical care is prohibited across the board, or not? We will begin with looking at two fundamental texts which seem to be opposing, and then we will get into the various perspectives of these questions and perhaps nuance and complex ideas which will give us an understanding in why it's important to consult with a rabbi, a competent rabbi in these areas, to have a proxy, perhaps and perhaps a proxy over a living will, and a stipulation that it's important to have a rabbi involved in the process from the Jewish perspective. Let's have a look at text 7. This is a story from the Talmud. This is what occurred on page 66. This is what occurred on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, just to refresh our memories, we discussed him last year in Booksmart. He was the one who authored the Mishnah. He was considered the greatest Jewish leader at his time, and perhaps one of the greatest Jewish leaders of all times. He lived in, probably going to botch this, but I believe it was in the 1st century of the Common Era. And he was passing away. It was on the day that he was passing away. And the Talmud tells a story. The sages proclaimed a fast, and they supplicated for divine mercy so that he would not depart from the world. Rabbi Yehuda's maid went up to the attic and prayed. The angels on high asked for Rabbi Yehuda to ascend, and the people below asked for Rabbi Yehuda to remain. May it be your will that those below prevail over those above. Now, before I continue, I just want to mention, we know from elsewhere in the Talmud that the maid in Rabbi Yehuda's home, Rabbi Yehuda's maid was not just a regular maid. She was actually very well-versed in Jewish law and Jewish texts, and she was quite a studious individual in her own right, and really a thought to be, a force to be reckoned with. And so she prayed that those below prevail. In other words, that Rabbi Yehuda should stay alive. Continues the Talmud. Later, however, when she saw that he was in great pain, she prayed, may it be your will that those above prevail over those below. The sages, however, would not cease praying, which prevented the heavens from gathering his soul. So she grabbed a jug and threw it from the attic to the ground. Stunned by the noise, the sages stopped their prayers momentarily, and in the intervening moment, Rabbi Yehuda's soul departed. Now let's analyze this text for a moment. The sages were praying, and that clearly is what was keeping Rabbi Yehuda alive in his pain and suffering. The maid came and said, let's stop this praying. She prayed to God not to listen to the prayers. It wasn't helping. The sages weren't stopping to pray. She forced the sages to stop praying by throwing that jug, causing them to stop focus and stop praying. And at that moment, Rabbi Yehuda's soul departed. There are two perspectives in this story. There's the perspective of the sages, who seem to be of the opinion that we have to actively keep a patient alive, even if they are in terrible suffering. Terminally ill, terribly suffering, we still have to actively keep the patient alive. And then we have the opinion of the maid, which is absolutely not. An individual who's terribly suffering, stop praying. Not withdraw. It's not considered withdrawal because it wasn't a medical intervention. It wasn't something that we're taking away from him. It's something on the outside. It's a prayer. It can be similar to withholding. So the maid's opinion was, no, we need to withhold the prayer and let the angel of death do what he's got to do. And the Talmud tells us the story and tells us that this is what happened. So perhaps we can glean from this text that withholding medical care in a case of a terminally ill patient who is suffering is fine, is permitted from a Jewish perspective. That is one text. Then we have another text. We have text 8 on page 68. A quote from Maimonides, and it's the laws of Shabbos, which we discussed earlier in lesson 1. Shabbat laws are suspended in the face of danger to life, as are all other mitzvot. Consequently, we follow the direction of a professional physician on hand and attend to all of the patient's needs on Shabbos. If a structure collapses on Shabbos, the rubble must be cleared if there is even a doubt as to whether a person is beneath the debris, although clearing rubble is otherwise forbidden on Shabbos. If a person is discovered alive, and here's the key, even if they are injured and crushed to the extent that it is impossible for them to recover, we must continue clearing the debris to extricate them in the interest of preserving life for a short time. What does text 8 show us? Here's an individual who is crushed. He's crushed, and we know the doctors say they've analyzed him under the rubble, and we know that this individual is crushed. He's suffering. It's terminal. He's going to die in a couple of hours. If we remove him and extricate him from the rubble, he will live another hour in pain and suffering. What does the law tell us? That we transgress the laws of Shabbos in order to give this individual an extra hour of pain and suffering. Which would seem to imply, from this ruling of Maimonides, that we must fight for every moment of life, no matter what the prognosis is, and no matter what the level of pain is. Which one is it? Are we permitted to withhold treatments if the patient is terminally ill and suffering? Or must we fight for every moment of life, no matter what the prognosis is, as text 8, the ruling of Maimonides, seems to imply? How do the halachic experts deal with these two seemingly opposing rulings, one from the Talmud, one from Maimonides? Which approach takes precedence? Do we say we allow death because, in the case text 7 of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, he's terminally ill, tremendous suffering, or do we say we have to fight for every single moment of life? And here's where it's going to get a little complicated. We will present 3 perspectives, one extreme following text 7, one extreme following text 8, and one which seems to be a balanced approach. These are the 3 perspectives we will present now. First perspective is, once again, from the contemporary sage who passed in 2016, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, in his responsa, Tzitz Eliezer, who we quoted right in the beginning of tonight's class. We quoted him last class in the case study. We quoted him. He was the one who presented case study B of the child, the 11-year-old, who is suffering from cancer and needed to be the tube switched out. And so he says as follows. He bases his ruling primarily on the ruling of text 8, which is we have to fight for every moment of life, no matter how much pain and suffering. Let's look at text 9. This is from that response. Text 9 on page 70. Jewish law asserts that we violate the laws of Shabbos even for the sake of one who is severely injured and can only live a little while longer. When we extricate this person, we inevitably prolong their suffering. Nevertheless, we are obligated to make every effort to prolong their life. If this is so on Shabbos, certainly on a weekday, we are obligated to make every effort to prolong life, even for a brief duration, and even if this entails additional suffering. So he goes full nuclear We got to do whatever we can to prolong life, even if it's only prolonging it for few moments, even if it's only prolonging it for an hour, and even if this individual is terminally ill, he's going to suffer, and this additional surgery or procedure or medication will cause additional suffering. He says, based on the ruling from Maimonides, Torah law mandates that we must do everything in our power to give every additional moment of life because of the value of every moment in life. Now, if he's ruling according to Maimonides, what's he going to say about the story from the Talmud, which seems to give the opposite, that, hey, the maid said, and the Talmud relates the story, which gives it the force of law to a degree, that no, we can withhold. And so perhaps in this case of the young boy, where he seems to rule, and he actually does rule, that this surgery must take place in order to switch the tube, even though it's only giving the boy an extra few, whatever it would be, days, months, weeks of life. But what type of life? A life of suffering, a life of pain, and the procedure is painful. And yet he rules that we have to give it. What would he do about the story from the Talmud, which seems to imply the opposite? So in another responsa, Rabbi Waldenberg argues that Torah law is decided by the majority. And the fact that the majority in the story are the sages who continuously prayed for Rebbe, and the only way she caused them to stop was by throwing the jug, means that the majority ruled that we're not allowed to withhold. And as such, he rules that what the maid did was actually prohibited. And therefore, we ought to follow Maimonides' ruling and go full throttle ahead by doing whatever we can, life at all costs, every single level of help, every single level of assistance and prolonging life, no matter how painful, no matter how terminally ill this individual is. We have to provide added, and we're not allowed to withhold any form of treatment, except for, and as we discussed at great length last week, except for an experimental treatment, which is risky, which doesn't have a more than 50% success rate. If it's less than 50% success rate, it does not have to be pursued. It is permissible to choose such risks, but it isn't obligated. But barring a risky treatment, Rabbi Waldenberg says that treatment cannot be withheld, no matter how painful, no matter how much suffering. That is on one end of the spectrum. There are some halachic experts still today who follow Rabbi Waldenberg's view, but that is a minority position. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the famed sage, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein also is a contemporary of Rabbi Waldenberg. He passed away in 1986. We've quoted him many, many times throughout many of our courses. He has a fascinating 9-volume responsa. And he writes as follows. Let's have a look in text 10a. He is the other side of the perspective with regard to the question of the spectrum, with regard to the question, can treatment be withheld? And remember, also, always keep in mind the underlying reasoning, spiritual reasoning, of where we get this from. It's from the Torah, it's from the reasons, the aforementioned reasons, the value of every moment of life. Yet Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says as follows, text 10a, page 71. If physicians can neither cure a patient nor ease their suffering, they should not administer treatments that only serve to prolong briefly the terminal patient's life and suffering. And what's his ruling? We infer this from the Talmud's description of Rabbi Yehuda's final illness. The sage's prayers did not produce a cure for Rabbi Yehuda or lessen his agony, but only prolonged his ordeal for as long as they continued to pray. Rabbi Yehuda's maid, who is knowledgeable in Torah, said, "May it be your will that those above prevail over those below," and upon seeing that her prayers cannot be effective as long as the sages continue their supplications, she took a jug and smashed it in order to silence them. At that moment, Rabbi Yehuda passed away. This incident is cited in the Talmud to teach us that the maid acted correctly. We can derive from this that a physician should not administer to a patient a treatment that will neither cure them nor alleviate their torment, but will serve only to prolong their life for a short duration in agony. The physician should only administer such treatment if it will soothe the patient. And that's only, he writes later, that's only if the patient wants it. So here we have the entire opposite side of the spectrum. Rabbi Feinstein says that there is a moral difference between actively killing someone to remaining inactive to passively allowing someone to die. And therefore, he derives from the Talmudic story that we do not say life at all costs. And therefore, he believes that the maid acted correctly, which is why the Talmud tells us the story. And therefore, he tells us that although we cannot euthanize a patient, he's definitely of that opinion, no physician-assisted suicide, no euthanasia, we can refrain from treatment if, number one, an extension in life will only be short-lived. In other words, the patient is terminally ill. And number two, the extension in life will be associated with excruciating pain. But he does make an important exception. And the exception is, he says, that this is only for extraordinary treatments. Those can be withheld. But natural way of living, in other words, hydration, nutrition, and oxygen, that cannot be withheld. And when I say oxygen, he doesn't mean a ventilator. He means something like a BPAP, which is non-invasive, which is not really minor pain, or perhaps not painful at all. He's not talking about a ventilator in most cases. He is talking about something more like a BPAP, which is an oxygen mask. And in these things, he says, this cannot be withheld. So withholding, in other words, withholding is something which is only permissible by extraordinary. In other words, anything which isn't natural. Food, water, and air is natural. And if that's natural, it needs to be given. It cannot be withheld. Let's have a look at the way he presents it. Text 10b, page 73. In my responsum to the physicians, in other words, he's referencing the earlier responsa, I wrote that one should administer oxygen to a terminally ill patient who has trouble breathing, even though no cure will result, because it eases the patient's suffering, for inability to breathe is tremendously painful. Accordingly, you asked regarding a terminally ill patient who is unable to eat normally, should we intravenously feed him and thus extend his life while prolonging his suffering when it appears that he has no pain in abstaining from food? And my response is clearly, we must feed the patients provided that it will not cause any harm. And that's an important statement because it does reach a point where feeding a patient will actually hasten their death. So medically speaking, there is a point where feeding the patient intravenously will actually hasten their death. And at that point, it actually becomes prohibited to feed the patient. But barring that point, if it's not going to cause any harm, we must feed the patient, for food surely strengthens the patient somewhat, despite the possibility that neither the patient nor his attendants are aware of this effect. There is no need, however, to provide medicine with the assumption that it too will strengthen the patient. And the distinction is obvious. Eating is a natural need that is required to strengthen one's body and mind. And so what Rabbi Feinstein believes is that hydration, nutrition, and oxygen through BPAP, something which isn't invasive, must be provided, not because they extend life, but because providing them will ease pain and at the very least will strengthen the patient so that he or she can cope better. And so perhaps we can say that essentially Rabbi Feinstein is allowing a form of hospice for these patients who are terminally ill and suffering. And the definition of the hospice is care that is centered on controlling pain so that the person can remain as alert and comfortable as possible. And that totally fits with Rabbi Feinstein's outlook. Nutrition, hydration, and oxygen alleviate pain and therefore actually ease the dying process. And a person has no right to cause themselves to suffer unnecessary pain, which is why Rabbi Feinstein considers it obligatory to accept these form of treatments unless they will harm the patient, even if they end up prolonging life for a short duration, even with suffering. And so Rabbi Feinstein will clearly disagree with the Cruzen decision on two accounts. First, he will never allow withholding a feeding tube unless it's going to harm the patient. And secondly, all medications must be administered to a patient in a persistent vegetative state. A comatose patient in a persistent vegetative state, we don't know if they're in pain. We don't know, and usually giving them medication will not cause extra pain. It's a little easier nowadays with the fMRI to figure out if the patient is having pain from them or not. And so that will definitely affect the ruling of Rabbi Feinstein and how to apply it. But generally speaking, all medications must be administered to a PVS, a persistent vegetative state, unless we know that the patient is terminally ill and their current existence is extremely painful. And so let's get back to case B, the case of the child, where Rabbi Waldenberg will say that this child must do this procedure, which is a successful procedure, generally speaking, even though it's invasive, even though it's suffering, even though it's prolonging his life for a short span of time, and it's causing him extra suffering. Yet Rabbi Waldenberg says that that procedure must go ahead. Rabbi Feinstein would probably say that the procedure does not need to be done because the boy is terminally ill and he's suffering and it'll cause extra suffering, and therefore it should not be done. And it's important to point out that Rabbi Feinstein says that even according from Jewish perspective, where the patient cannot express their wishes due to their age or due to their illness, then the family should make this decision. So here we have these two extreme sides. Can treatment be withheld? Rabbi Waldenberg says no, generally speaking, any type of treatment across the board, life at all costs. And Rabbi Feinstein says definitely treatment can be withheld, cannot be removed. We cannot, generally speaking, it's ethically questionable and has to be dealt with on a case-to-case basis, but generally speaking, switching off a ventilator is prohibited. But depending on the pain, depending on the prognosis, there may not be a Jewish legal requirement to put an individual on a ventilator. And therefore, except for, Rabbi Feinstein says that treatment can definitely be withheld, except for hydration, nutrition, and non-invasive oxygen. And except for, in other words, when all three, in a case where it isn't actually harmful to the patient. We then have a middle ground. The middle ground is a little more nuanced. The middle ground is a little more complicated. Not everybody follows the middle ground, but we'll present it. The middle ground is by, once again, another contemporary of these two sages, Rabbi Feinstein and Rabbi Waldenberg. The middle ground is by Rabbi Auerbach. Rabbi Auerbach, we quoted him earlier in lesson 1. These are three sages. Just want to point out parenthetically, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Auerbach, and Rabbi Waldenberg are three sages in any book of Jewish medical ethics by any author. Will definitely quote all three of these rabbis for their positions, for their analyzations, for their perspectives. They all had an extensive medical knowledge. They all had extensive Torah knowledge and were considered authorities in the area. So perhaps the two most authoritative books on Jewish medical ethics is, or three most, is by Rabbi Dr. Steinberg, who was really a pioneer in Jewish medical ethics, as well as Professor Avraham Abraham, and as well as Rabbi J. David Bleich. These are three really pioneers in Jewish medical ethics, and they quote these three sages, these three rabbis extensively. So getting back to the more balanced approach, perhaps the middle ground between the two extremes of Rabbi Waldenberg and Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Auerbach says as follows. Let's have a look in text 11. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach of righteous memory told me the following. There is a difference between treatments that satisfy the natural needs of a patient, or those considered ordinary treatments, and those that are considered extraordinary treatments. For example, if a patient suffers from metastasized cancer and is about to die, although they are in pain, we may not withhold the required oxygen, nutrition, and hydration. If they suffer from diabetes, we may not withhold insulin with the intention that they die sooner. Blood transfusions and any other medication that the patient requires, such as antibiotics, should not be withheld. On the other hand, there is no obligation to initiate an extraordinary medical procedure, that is, a procedure that would itself cause much pain, in addition to the pain that this patient already experiences, if this treatment has no chance of curing the underlying disease, but only of extending life for a short duration. So Rabbi Auerbach is doing over here, he's trying to accommodate the two conflicting values. On the one hand, we see from the story of the Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda that life at all costs. Sorry, that we don't say life at all costs, right? And the maid smashed the glass, we don't say life at all costs. On the other hand, we have the ruling of Maimonides pertaining to Shabbos, that we do say life at all costs. And as we saw earlier, that there are many ideas and reasons why every moment of life is valuable. And so Rabbi Auerbach's view is that all these ideas must affect the way we treat terminally ill patients. And therefore, he says that we look at treatments and say which ones are more painful and which ones are not painful. So in other words, he uses the terminology ordinary and extraordinary. And perhaps we can say that when studying his opinion, we can notice that the distinction is really between very painful procedures or those that don't really cause too much pain, or ordinary procedures. And therefore he says as follows. Say, for example, a terminally ill cancer patient or a stroke patient who contracts pneumonia. According to Rabbi Auerbach, we must give them antibiotics because this is a non-painful treatment. Likewise, oxygen, nutrition, hydration must also be provided, assuming they won't harm the patient, because their administration is not very painful. Insulin as well, or blood transfusion, falls into the same category. Because although these treatments will cause the individual to live longer, and which means for this individual more suffering, nevertheless, because the administration of these procedures is not very painful, they got to be administered. On the other hand, we are permitted to withhold procedures whose administration includes much pain. So surgeries, for example, in the case of the young boy, right, which Rabbi Waldenberg said, absolutely, we must do that surgery. Rabbi Feinstein said, absolutely, there's no reason to do that surgery. There's no obligation whatsoever. Rabbi Auerbach says, in such a case, or CPR, chest compressions with CPR, mechanical ventilation, these do not need to be pursued for a terminally ill patient who's about to die because they're painful and or they require sedation. And in such a case, a painful treatment for such a patient does not need to be administered. So perhaps he's a little bit more stringent than Rabbi Feinstein, but he's a lot more lenient than Rabbi Waldenberg. And so, even perhaps in a rare case where administering antibiotics would cause excruciating pain, for example, in a rare case of ALS, where even touching the body is excruciatingly painful, we do not need to administer these either. Nonetheless, Rabbi Auerbach agrees that the ideal is like Rabbi Waldenberg saw it. And therefore, he says that we should talk to the patient, the patient's family, to encourage them to accept Rabbi Waldenberg's opinion, but it's not an obligation. They don't have to. It's not an obligation. It's something that we should endeavor to accept life-extending treatment because of the values of life, the values of every moment of life, but it isn't an obligation. And in his case, hospice would not necessarily be sufficient. And therefore, let's just summarize the various opinions. We would say it like this. All agree, all of them, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Auerbach, Rabbi Waldenberg, and all other sages all agree that physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia is immoral. It's wrong. It's not allowed to be done. Removing a patient from a respirator, if it will directly result in death, is likewise highly problematic and should be discussed with a competent rabbi, as is all these details. All agree as well that we do not need to pursue risky treatments, experimental treatments, and they're definitely not obligated. The debate exists whether we can withhold treatments that pose little or no risk, whether it can be withheld and when it is appropriate to do so. Rabbi Waldenberg is a minority opinion. And Rabbi Waldenberg says that no, can't withhold anything. Rabbi Feinstein says, which is more closer to the majority opinion, Rabbi Feinstein says, yes, we can withhold treatment except for hydration, nutrition, and oxygen when it will not harm the patient. Most authorities follow the middle ground. Rabbi Auerbach, who says that we follow the pain and the prognosis, and we should encourage patients to accept life-threatening, life-extending treatment, but it isn't obligated if it is extremely painful. And if you look at page 77, we have a graph there that kind of summarizes the three opinions. These three are very really summarizing it. There's many, many more detailed questions, many more complexities in this area. But I just want to conclude with the following. When it comes to a DNR, do not resuscitate, or it comes to a DNI, do not intubate, right? And a living will's acceptable according to Jewish law. First off, I want to say, as I've mentioned many times throughout this presentation or throughout this lesson, every single case is different and it needs to be discussed with a competent rabbi. As we saw, the complexities, the wide range of rulings when it comes to certain areas. Other areas, it's unanimous, but when it comes to certain areas and perhaps the more common areas, it's wide-ranging, and therefore it's important for a competent rabbi to analyze each issue. But when it comes to DNR, DNI, living will, it's important to know that, first off, quality of life in Jewish law, really, age, mental awareness, physical ability generally play no role in end-of-life decisions, right? According to Rabbi Feinstein and Rabbi Auerbach, prognosis and pain are the important factors. And according to Rabbi Waldenberg, certainly quality of life does not play a role in end-of-life decisions. When it comes to DNR and DNI, there are 2 points. First off, a living will, which is kind of a checkbox, what's the word? A checklist of things. It's very hard, as we see here. Every case is different. And so to make a checklist and to forewarn for every scenario is nearly impossible, which is why a living will is highly problematic and definitely not suggested. There are living wills presented by various Jewish medical ethics boards in line with each one of these perspectives, Rabbi Auerbach, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Waldenberg. And if you'd like to have a look, I can send you the link after. It's in your books as one of them. It's more of a healthcare proxy, is more in line with the Jewish perspective, because the healthcare proxy allows the family member to involve or allows the person to appoint a rabbi in that position, or together with the family, or at least allows the family to involve a rabbi who's competent in these laws, to do things according to the rabbi's decision and the Jewish decision, excuse me. And it's important to note that it's perfectly fine to take the opinion of Rabbi Feinstein all the way on one end of the spectrum. And it's perfectly fine to take the opinion of Rabbi Waldenberg, who's all the way on the other end of the spectrum. And it's not, neither of them are wrong. It's based on the individual, it's based on one's understanding of it, and it's based on how one feels. And therefore, it's necessary in case by case. Another important point about a DNR and DNI is the idea that studies have been done, and it's been shown that when there's DNR, DNI, perhaps that may affect other care that medical professionals should be giving to the patients. When they see a DNR and DNI, in some instances, the medical provider will not give other medically necessary treatments, which is not included in the DNR and DNI, and yet they may not given. You can see that in text 12, text 13. But what's important is really the outlook that this gives us for end of life is not so much about end of life itself, but it's about how we live our life. The larger message of this lesson is not just about preparing for death or preparing for halachically acceptable advanced directives or for getting a proxy and so on and so forth. The study of this lesson really evokes the essential questions that each of us needs to ask ourselves every single day, and that is, why am I here? Why am I here? What is the purpose of life? Why did God put me in this world? What is my mission, and am I doing everything in my power to utilize every moment for another good deed, for introspection? Am I fulfilling my mission in life every moment in life? And this mindset is really crucial for life, because when we have this mindset and we face challenges, we face failure, we face suffering, even in minor challenges and failure throughout our days, if we have a mindset which is based on the benefits of life, perhaps even a minor challenge or a minor failure can throw us in disarray. But if we have this overarching outlook, which is God is in control, God had put us here for a mission, we have every moment of life is purposeful, is meaningful. So if something throws us a little bit askance, a small failure, a small challenge, a bump in the road, we're not talking about the major challenges which we discussed tonight, but even small things, it helps us knowing that we have a mission to accomplish, knows that despite whatever hardships and failings we may have, we will be sure to live a life to the fullest, to approach every aspect of our life with confidence, knowing that every moment of our life makes a cosmic difference.